Hello, I'm Rory Welsh. Thank you for joining me. Imagine an island. This island is very small. You can stand anywhere on it and see the vast ocean on one side and a shallow lagoon on the other. Encircling this lagoon are a series of similar islands. Collectively, these islands form your nation. You live cooperatively, as you have done for thousands of years. It is a safe, harmonious place, with few luxuries, but what there is sustains everyone. You get few visitors, but those that do come are welcomed with warm, local, genuine hospitality. Recently, however, you notice the tide rising higher, the ground shrinking beneath your feet. Fewer and fewer of your crops yield food. The skies that once brought you healing rains now bring punishing onslaughts. A distinct feeling hangs in the humid air, that your way of life may no longer be possible, that your home may soon exist only in memories like these. Welcome to Tuvalu. For those of you who haven't heard of it, and don't worry, no one I mention it to has, Tuvalu is a small island nation in the Pacific, about 700 miles north of Fiji. Its highest point isn't even 5 meters above sea level, which means that, based on current sea level projections, it will be underwater in the next 50 to 100 years. Locals fear it might be sooner. Long before that happens, Tuvaluans face an uphill struggle to adapt their daily lives to the changing climate. They're fighting the rising tide, quite literally. If there's one word to describe Tuvalu, it's vulnerable. In both environmental and economic terms, it's in a precarious position. It's highly dependent upon grants from international benefactors and on income from the Tuvalu Trust Fund. Much of its money comes from licensing, both from fishing and from its rather fortunate national web domain suffix, .tv. Lack of economic opportunity on the islands forces many Tuvaluans to pursue hospitality or agriculture-based work programs in New Zealand or Australia, sending remittances home. It's also still common to work on foreign ships in order to send money home. There's little industry or agriculture on the islands, and there's even less opportunity for those who've earned degrees abroad to pursue graduate jobs. Because it is so small, so remote, and so lacking in resources, the opportunities to expand its economy are incredibly limited. This all goes some way to explaining why the UN has designated Tuvalu a least developed country. These economic considerations have a direct impact upon the day-to-day lives of Tuvaluans. Everything must be shipped via Fiji, entailing high shipping costs, making goods very expensive. Long shipping times mean that there's little fresh food available and that everything must be packaged. As you might see from some of my slides, an influx of non-biodegradable plastics has led to a build-up of landfill waste on some of the islands. This, compounded by the endemic lack of space, affects all aspects of life. Linked to all of these issues are Tuvalu's pressing ecological concerns. Their inhabitable land is eroding about as quickly as my hairline, meaning that people are moving towards population centres to be closer to resources and infrastructure. This puts an even greater strain on already scarce natural resources. By unintended consequence, it also creates another point of vulnerability. Tuvalu is vulnerable to tropical cyclones. And whilst these are rare, the concentration of people and resources into a particular area increases the risk to the country as a whole, as well as that area in particular. It would be the difference in impact between a hurricane hitting London rather than the Cotswolds. But here we find a big difference. The idea of a major weather event devastating Britain is unthinkable. We would take any necessary measure to prevent it from even being a possibility, wouldn't we? The difference is we can. Tuvalu can't. Because of its small population and its lack of economic power, Tuvalu holds no sway over international environmental policy, and even if it did, it would have no means by which it can enforce it. It relies on international organisations, namely the UN, to do that on its behalf. And herein the problem lies. The UN has singularly failed to protect the interests of countries like Tuvalu in its environmental policy. And this isn't just happenstance, it's structural. Much as there are 5 countries that have permanent right of veto in the UN Security Council, there are a small number of powerful countries that wield de facto power over its environmental decisions. To put it in other terms, Tuvalu is feeling the effects of decisions that it had no say in. The countries with the most influence over UN environmental policy are also the biggest contributors of greenhouse gases. This is a widely known fact, but the implications are rarely thought through. The wealth of these countries insulates them to a large degree against the effects of climate change. They can reposition population centres, they can build infrastructure to protect against natural disasters, and they have enough basic amenities to distribute. This also points to a basic developmental issue. By placing significant limits on the amounts developing countries can emit, we risk preventing them from being able to protect themselves in these same ways. This could be another talk in and of itself. But isn't talk of dealing with the effects misplaced? Surely the focus should be on prevention. For countries like Tuvalu, there will be no cure. Without environmental reform, it will be underwater. Fortunately, we have a framework for dealing with greenhouse gas emissions and limiting them. The bad news is that it is, in legal terms, unenforceable. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015 and was hailed as a great advancement over its predecessor, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. It requires every country that signed it to review its greenhouse gas emissions targets every 5 years, and it draws no distinction between developed and developing countries, closing loopholes for countries like China and India. The method by which these targets are worked out is comprehensive and sensible and produces good results. Where the Paris Agreement fails is that it doesn't set out any penalties for countries that fail to adhere to their targets. And even if it did, the ability to penalise countries like America, China, Britain and so forth is fundamentally undercut by the lack of political appetite to expend diplomatic capital on environmental issues. This is symptomatic of the fact that the UN disproportionately represents the interests of its most powerful members and reinforces the disparities between them and the less powerful members. Any good faith attempt by individual countries, powerful or not, to act on the Paris targets come into conflict with the behaviour and interests of many multinational corporations, particularly in the manufacturing industry. Industrial polluters create financial incentives for countries to have loose environmental regulations. They form such a big part of so many economies that governments feel that they must accommodate them in order to maintain jobs and tax income. They can move anywhere in the world that's willing to accommodate them, and many countries feel they aren't in a position to say no. So we find ourselves with 2 issues and a possible solution. The issues are governmental and corporate behaviour, and the possible solution is the Paris Agreement. The Paris framework has a lot of notional value, but is unenforced. So how do we apply our solution? We must accept that the UN is not an effective body for limiting greenhouse gas emissions, and to continue to rely on it will only reproduce the results that Tuvalu has become used to. We don't know if we can save Tuvalu from submersion, to be honest, but it is clear that appropriate action would at least slow the process. So we must refocus our efforts on the national scale. Much as every person has the duty to reduce their carbon footprint, each individual now finds themselves with the duty of applying pressure to their government to act upon the targets set out in Paris. Every government, whether democratic or not, eventually has to respond to overwhelming political will. To put it in market terms, if we create a demand for governmental compliance, and we reduce the demand for activities which hinder compliance, we're very likely to produce politicians and governments that want to capitalise on that. And we don't care if they're doing it for self-interested reasons or not. We only care about results. The same goes for the private sector and multinational corporations. We've already seen a shift towards environmentally conscious products and services. But it's important that we apply market pressure to root out practices such as simply moving production out of view and into poorer countries. The world doesn't need any more ineffective middle-class saviours. Extinction Rebellion already have the monopoly on that. So what should we do? We must create a targeted, coherent messaging campaign that will attain critical mass. Social media provides us with the perfect platform for this. The Black Lives Matter protests last summer proved that, more than at any other time in history, informal political movements can influence formal political organisations, namely governments. Social media, coupled with the interconnectedness of the global consumer economy, provides us with an as yet unrealised avenue for achieving this. The nature of social media is, however, transitory, and where so many movements fail is in their inability to take on a lasting form. There's no straightforward way to overcome this, indeed, the rate of change will only increase. But by utilising these same tools of interconnectedness, we can not only influence the actions of developed countries, but we can sustain our movement by individually connecting with those whom our actions affect most. Every one of us can get on social media right now and find someone from a small island nation, an environmentally vulnerable country, and learn something about their lives. The great strength of these platforms is that people volunteer this information. I would encourage you all to do exactly that. So there is notional value in organisations such as the UN, but we can't rely on its powers of enforcement any more than we can rely on the selflessness of the individual countries that dominate it. We, the citizens of wealthy, powerful countries, are the only ones that can create accountability. Fortunately, this brave new world we're entering is more interconnected than ever, both economically and socially. We are presented with an unprecedented opportunity to collectivise our power around one clear, unified message, to act for the common good. Never think that the problem is too large. Each one of us can, through individual choice and action, influence global events. It might be that corporations and governments are the largest actors, but their power comes from us ultimately. We must never forget that. So we must become an actor in our own right and get behind one message, that we need change, and that some need it more urgently than others. By recognising this difference in urgency, we begin to create a lasting environmental consciousness that isn't bound up in statistics or Malthusian prophecy, but in empathy for specific people dealing with specific problems. Perhaps the greatest cause of environmental apathy is the feeling that the problem is too massive to relate to, both in physical scale and time frame. But maybe by refocusing our lens, we can hone in once again on that most relatable of entities, one another. And by doing that, we take the first step from apathy to empathy. And that is how lasting change begins. Thank you.